All right, hi folks. So part 2 of Animals 1. So the first part we were looking at different subgroups of Animals 1. So we looked at some sponges, some cnidarians, we looked at flatworms, and we looked at segmented worms, roundworms, and then also some arthropods. And I wanted to follow up by doing a dissection of 2 different worms. So we're going to look at a segmented worm and also a round worm. So let me get focused here. A little bit. So we're looking at these 2 different organisms, and the difference between the 2 is, well, there's a lot of differences between the 2, right? But the main differences between the 2 are the coelom status. And so I thought that if we did a dissection of each a roundworm, which is a pseudocoelomate, and a segmented worm, which is a true coelomate, that we could take a look at the complexity of the internal components and do a little comparison. So the first thing we need to do with any dissection is we want to see we want to orient our organism in a way that we're kind of working from the head down to the tail. And so when we're working with these 2 different worms, that can be kind of complex because worms have a little bit less differentiation on the outside of their bodies. But let's see if we can figure it out here. So we talked in the last video about earthworms and how we orient ourselves. And so with the earthworm, the first thing you want to do is find this kind of bulbous reproductive organ called the clitellum. And this is always going to be towards the front end of the organism. So here we have it right here, and it's closer to this end than it is to that end. So we know that this is the head end. So let's go ahead and pin this. Here's the head region. And then you can kind of see that it's twisting in on itself. And for a dissection, that's not optimal. So I'm going to try and straighten this specimen out to the best of my ability, and then we're going to pin the tail end. All right. And then here we have our roundworm. This is a pseudocoelomate, and it's pretty hard to tell the head end from the tail end. But from experience, I know that this end that has kind of this thinner tip here is going to be our head region. So we'll pin that. And then you can see that it's curved down here at the bottom. That's just part of when you preserve these organisms, sometimes they get caught in a specific kink. But I'm going to try and straighten this specimen out the best that I can. All right, so we have head region, tail region. Both of these organisms are going to have a complete digestive system, which means that you have a start and an end to the digestive system, right? The mouth down the length of the organism is generally the digestive organs, but a lot of that is intestine. And then we're going to finish off with the anus. Both of these organisms I picked 2 organisms or specimen, excuse me, that are about the same size, but generally that's just, I made it that way, but they're not generally going to be exactly the same size like that. But it's nice for our comparative study here. And what I want to do is I want to look at the internal components. So in order to do that, we're going to perform a dissection, right? Dissecting these 2 different organisms is really quite different, even though they look very similar. So the pseudocoelomate, this roundworm, is actually going to be more like a sac of organs, right? And the earthworm is segmented, and it's a coelomate, and it has a lot more complexity. And what that means for me as the dissector is also that I'm going to have a lot more that I need to negotiate here. One of the main things that happens with an earthworm is that it has a lot of connective tissue that connects the ectoderm, or the skin, to the internal components or the organs. So we'll take a look at that here. We'll just do part of this dissection. I want to show you how different it is to dissect them. And then I'll take a pause, I'll dissect the rest of it, and then we'll look at the internal components. All right, so I have this straight razor here, and this is my preferred tool for doing a dissection. They also have ones with handles, but for something small like this and linear, I really prefer the straight razor. And I'm not going to put a lot of pressure here because, like I said, the ectoderm on this roundworm is really just a very thin sac for the organs. And so just so I'm describing it to you, my straight razor is piercing the skin pretty easily. And let's take a look here. So then open this up and we'll pin it. We'll pin the skin back on both sides to expose the internal organs. All right. Moving down here. You can see that this is peeling away here pretty easily. So when we're doing a dissection, especially with something as small and thin as this, the real hard part is actually just not piercing the organs, right? Just only keeping it surface level and only peeling away that skin layer. So if I cut really deep into this roundworm, I would cut through the organs as well. And we want to keep the organs intact because that's what we're actually trying to open this thing up to look at. So a little bit of technique involved here. Okay, and I think that you get a pretty good feel at this point about how easy that process was. Now let's take a look at our earthworm and try and open the earthworm up. So I'm going to make an incision starting towards the head region. And it feels like where this felt like really easeful, this feels kind of like, actually kind of feels like, imagine I'm cutting through a rubber tire. It does feel a lot like rubber. All right, and I'm just going to cut to about right here. And then what you'll notice is I can't just open this flap up. There's some resistance, and that's because there's some connective tissue. So what I do is I take my pin here and I kind of drag it along the inside, right underneath the epidermis here, this ectoderm. And when I do that, I'm kind of cutting those connective tissues away from the organs. And it's a little tight up here, so I'm going to open up this cut up here a little bit more. See if we can get the head region opened up. All right, it's a good portion of it right here. So I'm just gently scraping away the sides between the organ, the space, I guess, the connective tissues that are holding the organs and the skin together. All right, and you can see that's a little bit more complicated or more effort than I had to take for opening this up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the video on pause, and I'm going to continue down the length of both of these organisms, open them completely up, and then we're going to do a comparison between the organ systems in each. All right, so I'm back with you, and I have opened up the ectoderm for both our roundworm and our earthworm. And I did confirm once I opened up this roundworm from the inside components, the internal components, I was able to confirm that this is the mouth end. So I did correctly orient these two. It's like I said, it's kind of difficult to tell because this thing is pretty simplistic. It's just a sac, but this This end is a little bit more blunt, and this one is a little bit more tapered with that pin-like end at the bottom of it. And so I did confirm that. I couldn't confirm it without looking at some of the stuff that we'll talk about here. So I thought we would start from the head region, and then we'll zoom in just a little bit. Oops. In, not out. All righty. Ceiling camera has pretty good amount of zoom. So here, when we're looking at our roundworm, you can see that the ectoderm came very cleanly away. And if I push these organs, they would just, I can just push them all the way out to the side. They'll just go wherever. There's not a lot of connective tissue that's keeping those organs in place. And that kind of comes down to that thought process about pseudocoelomate versus coelomate. So remember, with a pseudocoelomate, you have the gastrodermis, and that's the endoderm, right? And then around that, you have a complete coelom formation, so a complete circle of space. And then you have the mesoderm and the ectoderm, right? And so the space that the pseudocoelom takes, it kind of completely cuts off tissue layers. Whereas with a coelom or a true coelom formation, you have all of the tissue layers in contact with one another. And that part of that is going to be that these connective tissue bits are going to hold the organs in place. So let's try to do the same thing with the organs that we did on this other one. I cannot move them because they're connected by this connective tissue here. And we can see this here. And like, here's a really good spot where there's a lot of connective tissue here. So I had to separate that away from the organs because the organs were connected to the ectoderm using that connective tissue. So that's one difference between them. You can also see that complexity-wise, this has a lot of different forms, a lot of different kinds of forms and organ formation, whereas this has a bunch of squiggly stuff in it. And let's start with our roundworm. So here we have, the more I have my hand out of the way, the more the camera will focus in. So here we have the tip or the mouth. And with roundworms, we have a very, very, very simplistic digestive system. It's composed of a mouth and a esophagus, or we're going to say esophagus or pharynx. It can be interchangeable here. And it's just the assumption, there's really not any visual cues for me that this is the esophagus versus a different part. But I just know that after the mouth is the esophagus or the pharynx. And then from there, the whole rest of this is going to be intestine, all the way from here, all the way down to the very, very tippy end, which is going to be the anus. And the organs here, you would think that this really large coily thing is the intestines because the intestines are pretty important, but nope. Actually, this very thin ribbon, which I'm going to pull out for you, underneath all of the coily stuff, this thin ribbon here, and I'm going to actually pull it to the side so you can see how thin it is. Okay, that thin, thin, thin ribbon is going to be the digestive tract. After that, and the digestive tract, that thin ribbon is going to go from the esophagus, right? From the mouth, the esophagus, to the digestive tract, which at this point is the intestine, all the way down the length. Okay, so I could follow that thin ribbon all the way down the length of this. The other organs that you're seeing here are all reproductive. Okay, so let me try and separate some of this out. So there is one piece that is, and it's all coiled, so it's kind of, it's hard to separate out, but there's some tubing here. So I think you can see this. I'll take that out. So that tubing, this is a thick tubing, all right? And this tubing is going to be placed like this. So about, maybe about right here on the organism, about an inch or so below the mouth, this tubing is going to start, and it's going to start connected like this, all right? And then the tubes are going to separate away from each other. And this is actually the two tubes of the uterus, and the vagina would be here at the tip where these two parts come together, like where my fingertips are together, that's the vagina. And then the uterus are the tubes that come off on either side. And these two tubes are going to progress down the length of this until about, let's say, halfway down to 2/3 of the way down. And then they re-come together, okay? So they separated and then they come back together. But they don't come back together fully. So they come back like they sit next to each other. I apologize, that wording was kind of confusing. So they sit next to each other, they get close. And then from these big, large tubes, they get really, really small. And they become these thin string-like coils that coil up. And I'm trying to, yeah, can you see those? They're like little spaghetti strands here, these spaghetti strands. So this is what happens after the two sides of the uterus kind of end in how large they are. Then they become these string-like bits, all right? And the string-like bits are the ovaries, okay? So the ovaries are what actually are producing our eggs, right? And then we saw that with, we know what ovaries are. So string-like bits. Okay, so let's go over that real quick again. So we have the thin ribbon that is the digestive tract, very, very thin. We have this thick tube that starts about 1/3 of the way down the organism, and it's going to be the tubes, there's two of them, of the uterus. Those tubes of the uterus are going to go down to about halfway or 2/3, at which point they transfer, or they turn into these really, really small squiggly bits, which are the ovaries. And that's pretty much it in terms of the roundworm organ systems, okay? So it's just digestive system and reproductive system, and that's it. All right, so how does that differ then from our earthworm? So let's start at the very tip of the earthworm. We have the mouth, and then we have this implied esophagus or pharynx, like we were talking about with our roundworm. It's not visually very distinct, but I know that it's there because it comes after the mouth. And then you'll see these kind of white, chunky globs, okay? So this is not part of the digestive system, but I'm gonna point it out to you because I think it helps us to orient ourselves as to what we're looking at. So these white globs are actually gonna be the seminal vesicles, all right? So that's a part, that's not part of the digestive system, and I don't want you to concern yourself with what it is. But the important part is that they are on top of a certain length of this pharynx, okay? So the pharynx is going underneath these seminal vesicles. And then the next thing that I want you to notice is we have this change where we have a globular, or kind of like a swollen part of this, and this is the next organ here. So you can see it's kind of darker, and it's from here to here, okay? And that is going to be our crop. So we have mouth, pharynx, this kind of ball-shaped or globular thing, that's gonna be our crop. The next organ directly after that, you can see, is a little bit lighter. So from here to here, that's going to be our gizzard. And then we start here after the gizzard with the intestine. And the intestine is going to run the entire length all the way down to the very end, at which point waste would exit through the anus. And actually, if I pull this pen, you can actually kind of see, well, I can see it, and we'll see if you can see it in the video. There's a hole at the end, right, which is the anus. That's where the waste would be excreted out through. You'll notice that the intestine, even though it runs the entire length, it has some different characteristics here. And I just wanted to be clear with you that this is the intestine. This is also the intestine, but I dug a little bit too deep when I was doing my dissection, and I cut through the intestine here. And so what you're actually seeing here is the intestine has been cut, and that brown or dark stuff is waste product, right? So it's escaping through this cut open intestine. And I mean, it's kind of gross, but also, like, earthworms just eat dirt. So I'm pretty much just looking at digested dirt, and that doesn't freak me out too bad. But so that's why that looks different. I just didn't want you to think that it was supposed to look that way. So, and here you can see there were little cuts that happened along here and here. And then for the rest of the way, it didn't get cut. And really that's just because at the very, very tip of the earthworm, it got very, very thin and incredibly difficult for me to cut away the connective tissue there. So that's why those cuts are there. But let's follow it up. Intestine, 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 intestine. And let's do it backwards just for fun. So the intestine ends here. And then the first organ that we're going to come up to after the intestine is going to be our gizzard. And that's this organ here. The next round shape in the digestive system is going to be our crop. We have these seminal vesicles that are covering our pharynx that goes from the crop to the mouth here. So the mouth at the very tip. All right. So we can see that the earthworm is a lot more complex in terms of organ systems and digestive organs in general. And then the other thing I wanted to point out is, can you see this line, this dark line that goes along the length of the intestine? This is actually the dorsal blood vessel. So the blood vessel is going to go down on top of the length of the digestive system in the earthworm. And so it's just like a perfect line. So you can see how on this side, on this side, the line is a little bit shifted to this side, right? And then it evens out and it's kind of right in the middle of this part. So that dark line is the line of the dorsal blood vessel, all right? And so earthworms have a complete digestive system, and they also have a closed circulatory system, which means that their blood is contained within a closed container. So in this case, the vessels, right? And we don't have an enclosed circulatory system for the roundworm. So like I said, the roundworm is just a sac. It's got that pseudocoelomate body plan where it's mainly just a sac with a couple of organs, not a lot of organ formation, not a lot of complexity. And that's because even though we have the space to form organs, right, we have that coelom, we do not have a lot of tissue communication because some of the tissues, specifically the endoderm and the mesoderm, are not in direct contact with each other, so they cannot communicate. So remember that complexity is built off of the ability for the tissues to communicate adequately with one another. And so if they're not touching, they cannot accomplish that. So I hope this helped you to see the difference between a coelomate body plan and a pseudocoelomate body plan, the difference that makes on organ development and organ complexity, and then also the difference between well, they both have a complete digestive system, but the difference between a digestive system that is mainly just an intestine and then a digestive system that has a little bit more complexity in the digestive system, and also a little bit, I would say, more cephalization, right? So it was easier for me to find the head region on this earthworm than it was on the roundworm. So a couple of different things that we can consider in our dissection comparison here. And I appreciate your time and your effort to be here and to watch. And I will be back with you soon.